Welcome back to the deep dive. It's been a little while since our last one, hasn't it?
It has indeed.
Yeah, we really apologize for the pause. Things just got incredibly hectic after the summer holidays. But we are so thrilled to be back.
Absolutely.
And we're ready to unpack some really fascinating ideas for you, especially if you're interested in, that intersection of philosophy and faith.
Definitely. And today we're taking a deep dive into the really complex and, let's be honest, often controversial relationship between Enlightenment ideals and religion.
Right.
And we're doing it through the lens of a true giant, Immanuel Kant. We'll explore how he tried to square faith with reason, what he actually meant by radical evil.
Which sounds ominous.
It does. And maybe most intriguing, whether he believed there was something, divine about human reason itself.
Exactly. So our mission today, as always, is to cut through some of that dense academic language. We've gone through a whole stack of sources for you, scholarly articles, philosophy encyclopedias, even some more contemporary takes. And the goal is to pull out the most important insights. So you'll get a clear handle on Kant's really nuanced views, why they still cause such debate, and hopefully have a few aha moments without getting buried in jargon.
And we'll try to connect these, quite abstract philosophical points to some real-world stuff, too. There's a contemporary example from Brazil that really highlights why these debates about religion and reason are still so relevant.
Okay, let's jump right in then. This central tension. Kant, a key Enlightenment figure, trying to reconcile religious faith with Enlightenment morality. What was the main challenge he was up against, and how did that big work of his, religion within the boundaries of mere reason, how was that received?
Well, it's fascinating because his attempt, especially in religion, was controversial right from the get-go. He got flack from both sides, really.
Oh.
Yeah, devout Christians felt he was, watering down the faith, stripping away the miracles, the mystery. But then the secular philosophers, they often saw it as just superstition dressed up in rational clothes, like he hadn't really escaped tradition.
So it really shows, doesn't it? This struggle to figure out where religion fits in a modern, rational society. It's not new. Kant was right there in the thick of it.
Precisely.
Okay, here's where I think it gets really interesting. Our sources point out that Kant's thoughts on evil were kind of overlooked for a long time in Anglo-American philosophy,
That's right, surprisingly so.
despite him writing quite a bit about it later on. So how did his ideas about overcoming evil actually, change over time across his big works?
Yeah, it wasn't a static idea for him at all. He initially explored a few different avenues for, let's say, moral improvement. Like in his Anthropology, which came out in 1797, he kind of suggested that the cultivation of society, arts, sciences, could eventually help us overcome our baser inclinations.
So societal progress makes us better people.
Sort of. He even called passions like envy and greed cancerous sores of reason, but thought maybe, just maybe, social and cultural development could counterbalance them. It was more about the species progressing towards rationality.
And then there was that phrase from Idea for Universal History in 1784, unsociable sociability. It sounds like a contradiction.
It really does. But in Idea, he argued that maybe just civil institutions were enough. He thought this unsociable sociability, our tendency to be both drawn to others and yet conflict with them, the very thing that sparks ambition and greed, could paradoxically lead to a moral outcome.
How could bad motivations lead to good results? That seems counterintuitive.
Exactly. It's this idea that maybe our less noble traits within the right framework could spur progress, but it's a tricky argument.
Did he stick with that? Because it feels like that changes quite dramatically in religion.
Oh, absolutely. It's a major shift. In religion, he flat out rejects the idea that immoral passions can somehow magically produce morality. He becomes convinced that the only way to overcome our inherent propensity to evil is through establishing an ethical community.
An ethical community. What does that mean exactly?
He argues that since evil often arises from our social interactions, envy sparked by comparing ourselves to others, lust for power, greed only a collective effort, a society of virtue, can counteract these.
So it's not just about individual effort anymore. It requires a group project almost.
Precisely. This ethical community, he imagines it as similar to a political state, but based purely on laws of virtue, without any coercion. It exists within the political state, made up of its members. He's quite explicit. The dominion of the good principle is not otherwise attainable than through the setting up and the diffusion of a society dedicated to virtue, which reason itself commands us to build.
Wow, okay, so individual virtue isn't enough. We need this collective moral society. But that concept of radical evil itself, that caused a stir, right?
Yeah,
Why was it so shocking? Was it just Christianity's original sin sneaking back in?
it definitely shocked many contemporaries because it sounded so much like original sin, an idea that the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on human reason and potential, was trying to move away from. But, scholars like Allison and Muchnick, they argue it's actually consistent with Kant's overall rational morality. They see it as Kant trying to explain, rationally, why humans have this tendency to prioritize self-interest over the moral law. It's about how we subordinate the moral law to our inclinations.
Okay, so a rational explanation for a seemingly irrational tendency.
Yes, rather than a theological doctrine. But then you have others, like Gordon Michelson, who argue he was basically just recasting the doctrine of original sin using different language, different idioms.
Which really highlights that difficulty, doesn't it? Translating religious ideas into purely Enlightenment terms. Maybe those languages just don't fully map onto each other.
It's a fundamental tension. And it's important to remember the Enlightenment wasn't necessarily aiming for atheism across the board. As Genevieve Lloyd points out, the main target was often religious superstition. The goal for many, including Kant, was to find a way to accommodate religion into a shared public space of reason.
So Kant wasn't an atheist. He was trying to find a rational place for religion.
Exactly. He saw a role for rational religion in his system, particularly in combating evil and upholding morale.
Okay, let's dig into his foundations then. His epistemology, his theory of knowledge, is famously groundbreaking. How did that challenge traditional Christian ideas about God, even as he tried to accommodate religion?
Well, the absolute cornerstone is his distinction between phenomena and noumena.
Things as they appear versus things as they really are.
Precisely. Phenomena are things as they appear to us, filtered through the inherent structures of our minds, things like space, time, causality. We can't help but experience the world this way. Noumena are things as they might be in themselves, completely independent of our minds.
Like the raw reality behind our perceptions.
Kind of. And Kant's big claim is that human knowledge is fundamentally limited to the phenomenal world. We can only know things as they are structured by our own minds. God, belonging to the noumenal realm, is therefore beyond our theoretical grasp. We can't know God in the way we know scientific facts. This leads to a kind of philosophical agnosticism.
So no scientific proof for God possible, according to Kant.
Correct. And he further chips away at traditional proofs with his antinomies of reason. These are basically contradictions that reason falls into when it tries to think about ultimate unconditioned realities.
Like?
Well, the antinomy of time. Did the world have a beginning, or has it existed forever? Reason can argue both ways convincingly, but can't settle it. Or the antinomy of causality. Is there a first cause, or does everything have a prior cause infinitely? Again, reason hits a wall.
So theoretical reason ties itself in knots trying to grasp these ultimate questions.
That's the idea.
But he still found a basis for belief in God, didn't he? Through morality. How did that work?
Yes, this is his famous moral argument. It's not a proof, he insists, but a postulate of practical reason. He argues that morality requires us to strive for the highest good, a state where perfect virtue is matched by perfect happiness. For this striving to make sense, for it to be rational, we must assume that the highest good is actually achievable. And that, Kant argues, requires us to postulate God's existence as the guarantor that virtue will ultimately be rewarded with happiness, and the immortality of the soul to allow for infinite progress towards perfect virtue.
So belief is necessary for morality to be coherent. It's a practical need, not a theoretical discovery.
Exactly. It's what he calls the primacy of practical reason. Our moral consciousness demands these beliefs.
What about miracles then? So central to many faiths. Where do they fit in Kant's moral religion?
They didn't, really. He saw miracles as incompatible with the universal laws of reason and unnecessary for true moral religion. For Kant, the essence of Christianity lay in Jesus' ethical teachings, the moral example. Things like the resurrection, he interpreted them morally, not as literal supernatural events that violate natural laws.
So a very rationalized, moralized version of faith. Faith and theoretical reason are separate domains.
Fundamentally separate in terms of knowledge claims, yes, though practical reason leads us to believe certain things beyond theoretical proof.
Okay, this leads to a really intriguing modern idea. Is there something maybe divine about reason itself in Kant's view?
It's a fascinating question, and some recent scholarship, like Morgan Keith Jackson's work, explores this. Jackson suggests a few principles to unpack it. First, the principle of deficient reason, PDR.
Okay.
This just reiterates that our theoretical reason can't know God empirically, a posteriori. God remains fundamentally mysterious in detail. But Kant does allow for cognition by analogy. We can sort of fill out our concept of God based on our moral needs and reason structure. He even calls belief providential, necessary for our moral lives.
Like reason points us towards something it can't fully grasp.
Yeah.
What's the second principle?
The principle of rational faith, PRF. This emphasizes that Kant's own belief in God wasn't based on church dogma or revelation, ecclesiastical faith, but on pure rational faith. For Kant, believing in God is actually an act grounded in reason itself, specifically practical reason. It serves as a guide, a compass for us.
So our own reason is the guidepost towards this belief.
In a way, yes. And that brings us to the most provocative idea, the principle of divine reason, PDIR. Jackson argues this suggests that reason itself has its epistemological inception in God.
Whoa, okay. Not that reason is God, but connected somehow.
Exactly, connected. Kant talks about an ethico-teleology, the idea that God created the world specifically to allow for human moral development. Our rational nature itself, our capacity for morality, points towards this divine origin.
Is that where the Urbild comes in, the archetype?
Precisely. The Urbild is this perfect archetype or ideal of moral excellence that Kant says exists only in our reason, but then he hints it has come down to us from heaven, suggesting a divine source for our very ability to conceive of perfection. It's mysterious, he admits.
A divine spark in our reason.
Almost. And there's also the idea of concursus, divine assistance or collaboration. God helps us when we freely strive for good, but without compromising our autonomy. Ultimately, Kant suggests God created rational beings partly out of a need, as it were, to love and be loved by something outside himself. So our reason, leading us to morality and belief, fulfills this divine purpose.
This highest good seems to be the linchpin connecting morality, reason, and belief. Can you just clarify again what it is and why it forces us to believe in God and immortality?
Sure. The highest good is Kant's ideal world, one where there's both complete virtue and complete happiness. And crucially, happiness is distributed exactly in proportion to how morally worthy someone is.
A perfectly just world, morally speaking.
Yes. And Kant says our reason just unavoidably produces this idea. We can't help but think about it as the ultimate goal. We feel a duty to promote it.
Okay, so we have a duty to aim for this perfect world. How does that lead to God and immortality again?
Well, to rationally commit to this duty, we have to believe the highest good is actually possible to achieve. But perfect virtue, what he calls holiness, seems like an endless progress, not something achievable in one human lifetime. So we must postulate the immortality of the soul to allow for that infinite journey.
Right, and God.
And since there's no natural law we know of that guarantees happiness will perfectly align with virtue in this world, we need to postulate the existence of a cause of nature, distinct from nature. That's God, who can ensure that ultimate justice, that perfect proportion of happiness to virtue, eventually happens.
So the demands of morality itself push reason to accept these postulates.
Exactly. It's the primacy of practical reason again. Moral needs expand what reason finds necessary to believe.
But there's still that tension. Kant's theoretical philosophy describes a world of determined natural laws, while his practical philosophy is all about freedom and morality. How does he bridge that gap? It sounds like a huge divide.
It is a huge divide, the great chasm, he called it. He attempts to bridge it in his critique of the power of judgment with a third faculty, reflecting judgment.
Okay, what does that do?
Reflecting judgment allows us to view nature as if it were purposive, as if it were designed for our understanding. It doesn't prove nature is designed, but it's a helpful, even necessary way for us to think about it, especially when trying to understand complex things like living organisms. We see them as self-organizing, almost like they have a purpose.
So we look for purpose in nature to help us understand it. How does that connect back to morality and freedom?
Well, reflecting judgment ultimately leads us to consider the final end or ultimate purpose of nature itself. And Kant argues this final end must be humanity, but specifically humanity as moral beings.
Why moral beings?
Because, for Kant, the ultimate value of human existence isn't just being alive, it's what we do with our freedom acting morally and autonomously. So, thinking about nature as purposive leads us to see the world as if it were created to allow us to exercise that moral freedom, which reinforces the whole idea of striving for the highest good. It helps unify the determined natural world with our experience of freedom.
Okay, wrapping this all up, Kant clearly thought rational religion had a positive role in an Enlightenment society fighting evil. upholding morality. But looking around today, is that always how it plays out? Can religion function positively in a society based on reason?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it brings us to contemporary relevance. The source material we looked at brings up the case of Brazil and the significant role the evangelical church played in electing Jair Bolsonaro.
Right, whose administration was described, even by its own supporters, as fundamentally anti-Enlightenment.
Exactly. It wasn't just political opponents saying that. It was part of their stated ideology. You had Bolsonaro's slogan, Brazil above all and God above everyone, cabinet members opposing feminist and LGBTQ+ rights, even suggesting kids learn science from the Bible.
That starkly contrasts with Kant's vision of rational religion supporting public reason. It even sparked online debates in Brazil about whether Kant himself was anti-Christian.
It's a powerful example of how the actual influence of religion in politics can clash with that Kantian ideal. It really forces us to ask, can you neatly separate the rational parts of religion from the irrational or potentially anti-enlightenment aspects, like fanaticism or the rejection of scientific reason? Or is the risk always there?
So the question of whether religion can have a place in a modern, rational, Enlightenment-inspired society,
hmm
it's just as thorny now as it was in Kant's time.
It absolutely is. But maybe Kant's core insight still holds value. Perhaps true, Enlightenment isn't about rejecting religion outright, but about constantly challenging and rejecting superstition wherever it appears, including within religious traditions themselves.
A provocative thought to end on. That was a fantastic deep dive into Kant's really complex relationship with religion and reason. We hope you, listening, have gained some new perspectives on how this foundational thinker wrestled with questions that are still incredibly relevant.
Thank you for joining us for this exploration. If you found this deep dive valuable, please do consider following the deep dive wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you have a moment, leaving a 5-star rating really helps us reach more people like you who are curious about these big ideas. It lets us keep making these deep dives into complex topics accessible. We look forward to the next one with you.